Let me welcome all of you, students, faculty, staff, our special guests, and of course, our panelists. And I'm pleased to welcome you to what is the third event in the university's Proclaiming Freedom series. Just a little by way of background, this series is a year-long program here at the George Washington University, and it's commemorating several things. It's commemorating the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. It's also commemorating the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. I'll have a little more to say about that in a second. And it's trying to explore how we discuss and remember those significant events. What was their short-term and long-term significance to us as individuals, to us as a country, and in many cases, how it influenced the world. And then, of course, reflect on the unfinished work of America and continuing efforts to ensure that all our citizens have the rights of full citizenship rights of equality and freedom. I'd like to offer my personal thanks to everyone who helped organize this series, and of course a special thanks to those who are contributing their time and energy to this event and helped put it together. One of our aspirations at this university is to educate all our students who come from diverse backgrounds and to equip them to become well-informed citizens, citizen leaders who can be effective in a diverse society and a global society. Part of being an effective citizen is understanding history and knowing how we got where we are, what the issues were, and what the critical and transformational events were that led to the creation of the society we live in today. And that's very much why I'm so excited about this forum and, of course, this whole series. In a few moments, we'll hear some firsthand accounts from this remarkable group of women who were on the front line of the civil rights movement. Now, this is a heterogeneous audience by age. Some of us, including me, remember those events fairly vividly as a set of turning points in our nation's history. For others of you, our students for the most part, this is a part of history. And it's a little more difficult to understand the significance to the people who lived in that time of the events that transpired in that part of American history. And so part of what we're trying to accomplish for those of you who were there, to refresh your memory and have you contribute to the conversation around what that meant, and for those who were not born around the time I was, to be able to look back and place those events in context and understand how individuals contributed to them, what their own personal stories were, and what the larger picture was of a country undergoing its efforts to fulfill promises made through the Emancipation Proclamation. We'll learn a lot about a particular group, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. This was one of the groups that played an important leadership role in the civil rights movement of the time. And we'll also learn what inspired these individuals here to write a book about it. And the book's entitled Hands on the Freedom Plow. These are personal accounts by women in the SNCC, SNCC, as it was pronounced at that time, and I think still is. The panel is a great example of what can happen when people organize. And this was a group led predominantly by young people, and who organized and advocated for a change that made our society better, that corrected longstanding injustices throughout the country, that brought to the fore in a nonviolent way the fact that these injustices existed, and advocated for effective positive change. These moments were transformational in our society. And yes, there is unfinished work remaining to be done. But to understand how much better our society has gotten with respect to racial justice, with respect to full rights of citizenry, with respect to voting rights, with respect to participation in civil society, is crucial. This was a transformational time, and it was a tribute to the people who led those efforts, and frankly, a tribute to the entire country that could find a nonviolent way in the main to correct longstanding injustices. It has always been the American genius that despite things that were wrong, we find ways to correct them, that the Union held since the Civil War, and that ultimately people of goodwill were able to gather together to effect positive change. And these women here are very much part of that story. So it's with great pride that we have them here to hear their stories. I hope they'll inspire you to think of ways that the remaining injustices you see in front of you, both here in the United States and elsewhere, can be corrected, and how to become effective at doing so. And I'd like to thank you all for taking time to join us here. And now it's my great pleasure to invite Professor Robin Marcus to the stage to open discussion. I do want to apologize that I can't stay. I have another appointment, but I've been kept informed about this, and this is an event that I'm sure to hear great reports about. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Provost Lerman and Vice Provost Reed. It is my honor and privilege to introduce our esteemed guests and panelists to our audience this evening and to moderate this conversation. These are 4 distinguished women out of 52 co-editors and contributors, Black, white, Latina, whose essays make up the book Hands on the Freedom Plow. Their lives, life's work, and words remind us that even an intractable world or system or institution, when effectively challenged, can in fact change, can even fall, when ordinary people answer the call of history. In answering this call to serve, these women, then high school or college age, helped ignite the civil rights movement, which some would argue is the godmother of all the civil or human rights movements that followed. In answering this call of history, they became extraordinary human beings who continue to teach us how to step up, how to change the world. In terms of how the evening will proceed, each panelist will discuss how they became involved with SNCC and then read an excerpt from the book, which I understand took 15 years to complete. And that's worth a lot. Hallelujah. If you ever try to write anything. We hope this conversation tonight inspires you to learn more about this era, but also to think about how you can apply or even upgrade some of the ideas and they share to the social justice issues of your generation. There is much work to be done and enough to go around. As you listen to their comments, please take notes. Yes, I'm talking to you. A question and answer period will follow, and we look forward to hearing your responses. This is a unique opportunity for the generations to interact and learn from each other. Our first panelist is Judy Richardson, who was on the staff of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, in the early 1960s. She is the producer of the award-winning 14-hour PBS series, Eyes on the Prize.
There were many.
Okay, so, and a humble woman at that. So, she is one of the producers of the award-winning 14-hour PBS series, Eyes on the Prize, and PBS's Malcolm X Make It Plain. She writes, lectures, and holds workshops on the history and relevance of the civil rights movement. She received an honorary doctorate from Swarthmore College and is a distinguished visiting professor at Brown University. Welcome, Professor. Next, it's Joan Trumpauer Mulholland, who is a native of Arlington, Virginia, and participated in the 1961 Freedom Rides, resulting in her arrest along with others. Joan became one of the first whites to integrate Tougaloo College and continued to work in the movement. She participated in the May 1963 sit-in at the Woolworth's lunch counter in downtown Jackson, Mississippi. Joan has taught for 30 years in Virginia and raised 5 sons. Welcome, Joan. Next, Martha Prescott Norman Noonan was a member of Students for a Democratic Society and a fundraiser and field secretary for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, again SNCC, during the 60s. She is a student and teacher of history, earning her MA degree from Wayne State University and completing almost all the coursework for a PhD in history at the University of Michigan. She remains a community organizer, developing and directing various social and educational programs for children and families. Welcome. Next, and finally, Betty Garman Robinson is a lifelong community organizer. While with SNCC, Betty was chairman of the University of California, Berkeley Friends of SNCC chapter and worked in several of the organization's offices throughout the South and later in Washington, D.C. She has worked at the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health as a researcher on injury prevention and HIV/AIDS studies. She currently works as a community organizer for Unite Here, the international union which represents hospitality workers. And welcome, Betty. Okay, so now we'll hear from Judy, who will give us a brief history of this enormous world of SNCC and discuss the book, how it came to be, and then read also from your section of the book.
Yes, and I've timed this precisely, so I hope this actually works out. I'm going to start with, and by the way, in their own presentations, if I've left something out, you all do it in your allotment of time too. Okay, so what was SNCC? I always assume nobody knows what we were. Okay, so SNCC is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. This is the organization that grows out of the February 1st, 1960 sit-in that was begun by black college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, at North Carolina A&T. The sit-ins then mushroom throughout the South, organized primarily by students on black campuses. So, Julian Bond, whom you all know, chairman of the NAACP and bunches of other things, and our narrator on Eyes on the Prize, he comes out of the Atlanta student movement, Morehouse. John Lewis, whom many of you know as a U.S. congressman. Julian, by the way, was our communications director. John Lewis was our chairman, one of our chairmen. John Lewis becomes a U.S. congressman, but back then he and Diane Nash and a number of other students come out of the Nashville movement. These students are therefore then leaders on their own campuses at this point, 1960. They are then brought together by Miss Ella Baker. She is at that point executive secretary of, and I'll just say it as a shorthand, Dr. King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. And Miss Baker is this legendary woman who begins organizing starting way back in the 1940s, particularly in the South. So she is, among other things, director of branches for the NAACP, organizing as a lone woman going through the South, organizing NAA branches when you could be killed if you were caught with an NAACP membership card on you. So people would hide them in bureaus and in shoes at the backs of their closets. Ms. Baker then sends out a call to all the student leaders throughout all these colleges in the South and brings them together for a conference at her alma mater, the HBCU Shaw College in Raleigh, North Carolina, on April 15, 1960, and SNCC was born. Now, Ms. Baker becomes the key advisor to the students, and it's her skills and contacts and grassroots organizing philosophy that infuses SNCC when it begins organizing in Southern communities. Now, SNCC's initial campaign was to desegregate lunch counters. But then the organization moved on to broader issues like voting rights, how do you get black people registered to vote without getting them killed, economic justice, and education. SNCC was the only national civil rights group founded, led, and staffed primarily by young people. It was also always majority black and was considered by many to be the most progressive, some would say radical, of the national civil rights groups. SNCC organized to make not just cosmetic change, but fundamental systemic change, to challenge white supremacy at many levels. Because we knew that it wasn't about individual racist sheriffs, it was about the racist system that grew these people and supported and sustained them. So throughout the 1960s, SNCC's young full-time organizers worked building local grassroots leadership, primarily in the rural areas of Mississippi, Alabama, and Southwest Georgia, also in Arkansas, where it was the most dangerous. And we were often guided, supported, and protected by older black activists, many of whom had been organizing for equal rights and risking everything before we ever got to their communities. Now, why we did the book, the handbook, and they'll talk about this as well, but as was said, we worked for 15 years on this. At many points, we all thought, I'll tell you in a minute who we were. At many points, we thought the book wouldn't happen. We thought we would be going to book parties on our walkers, and we were only half joking, let me tell you. The book is, as was said, 52 women's stories. There were 6 editors, 3 African American, 3 white. We editors met in Baltimore, usually 4 to 5 times a year for the first, about the first 7, 8 years. Now, it wasn't always easy, because we were 6 strong women. We were SNCC women. And I say that because it's important that young people understand that when they have difficulties, sometimes, young people come up to us and say, well, I don't know how you did it because there must be something we're doing wrong, they would say. No, we had problems too. We didn't always get along. But the main thing was the larger goal. And for us, the goal was we got to get this book into people's hands. So we knew we had to stay together. These women's stories were too important, particularly to coming generations, and they had to get out in the world. And as editors, we were reading all of these women's stories, and we realized how much we didn't know about each other, even among the editors. Because during SNCC, we just done the work and accepted everyone based on their work and on our relationships with them. So we often didn't know each other's background, each other's grounding. So there were a lot of revelations for us as well. Now, I'm going to just use the book for a second. Why we did the book, there is a wonderful piece in here. And it's the intro. And I would ask that you all read the intro before you start it. Now, the intro starts, "The book you are holding in your hands will open the door to a special world. It is a book by women who now mostly in our 60s and 70s, and that started being 50s and 60s, but it went on so long, are teachers and organizers, doctors, nursing home workers, singers, farmers, television documentary producers, nurses, homebodies, and professors. But in the 1960s, some of us leaped over the expectations of our families and communities, while others acted out of family and community traditions of social justice, all to become organizers and agitators in the civil rights movement." Toward the end, it says, "When you open this book, you will enter a different world. A world where danger is ever present, beatings, shootings, bombings, and church burnings happen all too frequently. The issue of the day is always how to make social and political change, how to press forward, how to keep going. In short, how to make a movement. In this world, freedom and justice are real, solid, and tangible. Freedom and justice are the reasons for being and doing, and the reasons for dying. Though the voices are different, they all tell the same story. Of women bursting out of constraints, leaving school, leaving their hometowns, meeting new people, talking into the night, laughing, going to jail, being afraid, teaching in freedom schools, working in the field, dancing at the Elks Hall, working the phone lines to relay horror story after horror story, telling the press, telling the story, telling the word, and making a difference in this world." And that's just the intro, okay? Now, nope, let me just put this up here again. Okay, this is yours, okay. Now, the so-called master narrative, the common assumptions, had us, the women of the movement, as poor little oppressed women, kind of like, oh, Rosa Parks, poor little tired Rosa Parks, same stuff, okay. We were some strong women, and many were leaders in their own right before they come into SNCC. So you have a story here, Diane Nash, one of the main leaders of the Nashville movement, instrumental in continuing the freedom rides after the buses are attacked in Alabama. Her piece is in here. Many of us refer to Ruby Doris Smith Robinson, who died before the book came out, dies at the age of 24. She comes out of the Atlanta student movement and refuses bail, does 30 days of hard time in Rock Hill, South Carolina, and in fact becomes executive secretary in 1966 on a slate with Stokely Carmichael as chair. You have the stories of Joyce and Dory Ladner. Joyce is in our book, and Dory has lived here for years here in DC.
Joyce was at Howard.
Oh, yeah.
Joyce was at Howard.
Oh, well, Joyce was president. Well, if you go through her history, yes, indeed. Joyce comes out of SNCC, gets her doctorate from Washington University in St. Louis, does seminal books around Black sociology and how Black people, the Black community, is treated. And so, see, that's the problem. I had this down. Okay, I can't go into that.
Sorry.
But one of the things she does is she becomes president of Howard University and also retires as a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. Okay. But what they were, she and her sister Dory, were strong student leaders in the Jackson, Mississippi movement, who are mentored by legendary leaders of the Mississippi movement, Medgar Evers, Clyde Kennard, and Vernon Damer, all of whom are essentially assassinated. So, movement scholarship, another thing, movement scholarship, except for some of the important, more recent work on local movements, really focuses almost exclusively on the men, and really mainly on Dr. King. So, also, the scholarship generally hasn't included the incredible local women who were the bulwark of that movement, both as leaders and as troops. So, one more time. You see the cover of this book. Now, this is from an Albany, Georgia, Southwest Georgia mass meeting. Mass meetings were where the business of the movement was done. And so you see all these women. Now, in fact, in most mass meetings, the majority of the people in that mass meeting would be women. But what you see on these white pieces of paper are their commitments, signed commitments to go to jail the next day. So we wanted a way to provide a way for SNCC women to tell their own stories without having to go through anyone else's filter. And I'll end with the book's giving the kind of common misperceptions that the book gives the lie to. One is that everyone was philosophically nonviolent, not just tactically, because the whole power of the state would come down on you if you tried to defend yourself, but more, the assumption is that everybody is philosophically nonviolent. No, there is much about self-defense from local communities, and certainly Gloria Richardson, oh my goodness me, but also a number of other folks in our book talk about that. And in fact, a lot of us understand that the reason more of us didn't get killed was because there were people who protected us. Another misconception, that it's the younger generation opposing the older generation. No, we're often building on the hard and dangerous work of the older activists who came before us, and we're working with them and being guided by them. So in our book, Hands on the Freedom Plow, you see intergenerational support, you see the strength of family and community, you see the level of violence instigated by white terrorists and the kind of state-sponsored terrorism that existed then. And this is key, you see the humor that got us through and that held us together. You see in this book what we did as young people in the movement when we were 16, 17, 18, 19 years old. And our most important, and I'll end this piece with this, our most important message is to young people. We hope that young people will see themselves in our stories and know that they can do something about what's wrong today, because we knew we were powerful. Now, changing a page. Okay. I'm now going to just do a real quick thing because I'm trying to think. I think I'm okay. I'm going to do the intro to the reading, and then okay. So now I'm shifting off, and I'm going to talk about me and my piece. Okay. Just understand that SNCC, it changed me. It changed who I was. Oh, by the way, I'm sorry. Did I tell you? I mentioned Miss Baker. Don't go back. Don't worry. But when I mentioned Miss Baker, I wanted to make sure you knew. It's really important that you know about her. I just realized when we changed this, back to my piece. You all should read about Miss Baker. Okay, so SNCC changed me. Now, I'm the one staring vacantly into space in the middle there. Okay, that's how I usually looked. People see defiance. I think what it was is that it was like, what am I doing here? But you can see whatever you want, because I'm not really sure what I was thinking. SNCC changed me. It changed who I was. It changed who I became. It changed what I chose to do with my life, and it gave me new eyes. I saw the world differently. Who I was before I come into SNCC is a young woman growing up in Tarrytown, New York, which most of you only know from the Tappan Zee Bridge if you're coming through. But it's the author Washington Irving's territory. So I went to Washington Irving Junior High School. I went to Sleepy Hollow High School. Our football team was the Headless Horsemen, go Horsemen, go. And so we were steeped in tradition, right? But also, my dad, my father, and the fathers of everyone I knew worked in, it was just called the plant. It was the Chevrolet plant that all the fathers worked in. My father had helped to organize the union local there, the United Auto Workers local. And when I was 7, he died on the assembly line of a heart attack, and at that point he was treasurer of that local. Now, my mother then becomes is no longer able to be just a homemaker, not just, but has to go out and work. And so,
For pay.
for pay, excuse me, for pay. Good point, thank you. And so she becomes the sole support of the three of us. And so she gets my older sister, Karita, to Bennington College in Vermont. And she gets me, with her 8th grade education, and gets me to Swarthmore College on a full 4-year scholarship. Now, Swarthmore is an elite Quaker college, right? And they were looking for more black folks. So we come in with this big class of black folks in our freshman class, 8 of us, okay. And what I find when I get there is that there is an SDS chapter on campus. Now, SDS, and I know Martha will probably explain more about this, SDS was the Students for a Democratic Society. It is an organization of primarily white progressive college students who worked for social justice in the North, but were very supportive of SNCC's work in the South. So when I get there, I'm exploring all this stuff. I'm, on my own for the first time. Oh my God, okay, I get to SNCC and I get to, okay, I only have 2 minutes. Okay, we're gonna just, working on several issues, SDS chapter working on several issues. I then go through, I get on the bus on a lark to go down with one of the campaigns to desegregate facilities in Cambridge, Maryland, Eastern Shore, Maryland. I go, not commitment, it's because my mother's not there to stop me. And so I decide that, okay, I'm gonna take off the next semester of my sophomore, I'm gonna take the first semester of my sophomore year off and work with SNCC. And then, unfortunately, I now don't have time to read my piece, but when I get to SNCC, I end up going to the Atlanta office and, can I have
Tell the story.
Okay, I'm just gonna do this. It's really quick, okay. I get to the national office. I see the national, and this is from the book. I see the national office of SNCC for the first time in November 1963. It was a teeny, rundown office at 8.5 Raymond Street, a one-block side street off Hunter, which is now Martin Luther King Boulevard, near the Atlanta University Center. The office was located on the 2nd floor above a beauty shop. It definitely did not fit my image of a national office, because I'm thinking, at least, rugs on this floor, Urban League maybe, something, okay. So I was 19 and had gone to Atlanta with Reggie Robinson, who was SNCC's field secretary and was the person who was working with Gloria and the Cambridge movement to organize in Cambridge. So from the downstairs glass door of this national office, I see this large man at the top of the stairs, dressed in overalls and sweeping the stairs. And Reggie saw him too and then ran up the stairs, and with broad smiles and much hollering, they hugged each other like long-lost brothers. And I thought, whoa, this is truly an egalitarian office, since I assumed the man to be the janitor. It was only after Reggie called the man's name that I realized this was Jim Foreman, SNCC's larger-than-life executive secretary. There was such joy, warmth, and affection in this moment that I thought, Judy, you haven't just joined an organization, you've joined a family. SNCC really is a band of brothers, and later we'd add and sisters, and a circle of trust. And I assumed I'd be in it the rest of my life. Now, I later found out that Foreman often swept up, and not so much to clean the perpetually dirty office, which was good since he wasn't all that good at it. Rather, he was showing us that, as he often said, no job was too lowly for anyone in SNCC to do, and every job was important to sustaining the organization. So Reggie introduced us, and through questioning, Foreman found out that I had taken a semester off from Swarthmore, and that I could take shorthand, which is kind of like texting but with symbols, and that I could type 90 words a minute. And I never made it back to Cambridge. And I get sucked in. I get sucked in by the energy and the passion and the brilliance of SNCC folks and the local folks around me, and my supposed 6 months leave from school becomes 3 years. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you
okay,
very
now
much.
you guys.
And we'll consider that a teaser. The books are going to be available. They're in the bookstore, I understand, and also for sale this evening. So do you want to know the rest of the story? Get the book. Next is Joan Trumpauer Mulholland. We are aware of your schedules, so we have a timekeeper here to help us keep you to your obligations.
The idea of limiting people from talking in SNCC is just counter-revolutionary.
Understand. We understand.
And you talked about how we're still learning things about each other. I just realized in that picture at the lunch counter, we were at the same lunch counter.
At the Toddle House?
Yes.
In Atlanta?
Yes.
Oh my gosh,
After all these years.
that's amazing.
50 years later, I realized.
In that same
it.
sit-in?
Yeah. My head was down, so you don't see me in most of the pictures.
Oh, that's amazing.
It's a small world.
You can run, but you cannot hide.
That's right.
Remember that.
So Joan, tell us how you became involved with SNCC.
Okay, I grew up across the river. Actually, I was born in Washington, D.C. I claimed that as a native, which was a rarity then. But people say, oh, that's Northern Virginia. It's not, it's not the South. We stood in school to sing Dixie. That's the South. This is, Robert E. Lee was my homeboy. pretty Southern. But I went to Sunday school regularly with the Presbyterians, and we had to memorize Bible verses, and if we could recite them perfectly, we got a gold star. Inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these, my brethren, you've done it unto me. King James. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, for such is the kingdom of God. All these things. But the church was segregated by law as well as custom, and as soon as we walked out the door, we continued to be total hypocrites about what we said we believed. Got into high school. Back in the day, you had to memorize the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and the teacher would snap their fingers and point to the next person, and you'd pick it up right there. You had to stand and recite, stand and deliver. And again, hypocrites. So I resolved, being able, to see what was going on, that as a Southerner, I needed to do what I could to make the South a better place when I had the opportunity, a good place for everybody, no more Little Rocks. And we were threatened with something similar under massive resistance, the closing of the schools. The girl sitting next to me in 11th grade Spanish class should have been in her senior year, but the schools had been closed in her town, and she wasn't going to the prom. She was living with relatives she didn't really know too well. So I had this vision that I should be doing something, this conviction. I wanted to go to a small church school, I think in Ohio. My mother wouldn't have it. I was to go to Duke University. It had some prestige with it instead of this little no-name podunk Presbyterian place, and it would be safely segregated. Her worst nightmare was that I would be in an integrated classroom. She was from Georgia, a product of her environment, I must say. Well, Mom made a big mistake. The sit-in started February 1st, 1960 in Greensboro. The next place they happened was Durham, where Duke was. I don't know how it got going, but our Presbyterian chaplain said for our youth group the next week there would be some of the students leading the sit-ins from North Carolina College, the black school, the other side of town. And they would be explaining to us about the sit-ins. Well, they did a fine job, morally and legally justifying the sit-ins, and at the end invited us to join them. My roommate, who was from New York City, and though she was of Italian ancestry, people looking at her on the picket line weren't always sure if she was white or black. Lucia and I joined SNCC on the picket line in Durham. I would have gone to this first gathering at Shaw, except it was decided that sending a white female representing Duke could be endangering everybody. And I don't view that as discrimination, I view that as sanity. There was no reason for me to go there and endanger everybody else. So I wasn't at the founding meeting, but that's how I got into SNCC. What are we showing? That's just a cracker from Georgia, that T-shirt says.
No, that's what
White
it says.
folks
That's
in
what it
Georgia,
says.
I didn't read
yeah, white folks thought that, cracker was a compliment. At Tougaloo College, where that was taken, cracker was an insult. As Joyce Ladd knew it. Polly wants a cracker. So that got me into SNCC. Mother's big mistake of wanting me to be down at this big name school. And I dropped out. I couldn't. Duke's administration and I did not get along after a couple of arrests and, the H double scribble with them. So SNCC, instead of causing me to drop out of school, in the end brought me back into school because my reaction to Charlene Hunter, you may know as Charlene Hunter Galt, and Hamilton Holmes being driven off the University of Georgia campus was these folks were my people who were doing this to this young lady. Mm. My family was from rural Georgia. I could have had relatives in that mob getting them run off. I should make at least the gesture of integration of the schools being a two-way street if it's going to be for real, and I'd apply to some historically black colleges. And somebody in SNCC, probably Chuck McDew, said, well, if you're going to do it, may as well apply to Tougaloo because nothing's happening in Mississippi, and if they don't get something going, you should be there. I wanted to graduate from college, so it was an accredited school, and I applied and was accepted. And then they had the library sit-in, where 9 students were arrested, and then they had the freedom rides. So I spent the summer on death row at Parchman Penitentiary from the freedom rides with free room and board until time for the semester to start.
For how long?
About 2 months up there and some time in the county jail. Let me just read my little part from this. Since I'm down to, I've already seen that 5-minute sign and she's getting that 3-minute one ready. Now, my problems with the book were not as an editor, I just contributed. This was my editor. And I wrote, I am Southern and white, as Southern as the red clay of Georgia, as Southern as Lee's mansion overlooking the Potomac. Northern Virginia is where I lived. Rural Georgia was down home. My grandmother used to say the only foreigner we ever had in the family was a Yankee. As a teenager witnessing Virginia's campaign of massive resistance to court-ordered school desegregation, I knew something was terribly wrong in the South. Both as a Christian and as a Southerner, I felt that when I had a chance to do something to change things, I should do it. We Southerners needed to put our own house in order. You know, we'd had carpetbaggers once before. Well, now my problem was this Chicago handbook that they follow or something to decide when to capitalize things.
Oh, the style, yes.
Now, hold this thought. Chicago is in the north. We had in 5 sentences, we had 5 bones of contention. I won 2 of them. Lee's Mansion, they didn't want to capitalize it. It's the name of a building like White House or Buckingham Palace. Capitals.
You mean with University of Illinois Press for your piece?
Yes, they did not want to the University of Illinois, Chicago.
Yes, right.
Home of Lincoln. I had my sister looking on eBay, I kid you not, for old souvenir plates showing how you write Lee's Mansion. They finally caved in. Then we had massive resistance. Now we're not talking about, I've got 2 minutes or 3, I can't read it.
2, you have 2.
Some large gathering in Tahrir Square. We are talking about a state law, which I've already explained what it did. You know, like No Child Left Behind. It was the proper name of the law in Virginia. I went into the Virginia room of the Arlington County Library. Now this is really sort of a warren of rooms, and explained my problems to the head librarian there, and she laughed and found a whole shelf of books about massive resistance, all with capital letters. So they gave in. But then we have the term Southerner. Now when I said I'm Southern, they capitalized it. But after that, they wouldn't. Now, to me, it's a term that refers to a specific group of people united by language and history and geography. You know, like Canadian. They capitalize it if you say a South American. They capitalize it if you say a South African or a South Dakotan. They capitalize South. But these folks in Illinois, using the Chicago book, would not capitalize Southerner, a noun. But you know, they never, ever questioned capitalizing Yankee. Now you go figure, who is fighting the Civil War to this day? So that was my little go-round with trying to get something in the book.
Thank you.
And Martha suffered through all of it,
That's right, I was the messenger.
back and forth.
Were you an
She has
English
a-
major, Joan?
What?
Were you an English major?
No, I was a history major. It had the least math and science possible. It beat out sociology by 3 hours of statistics.
Okay, because this discussion sounds very familiar about
anybody
capitalizing,
dealing with
lowercase,
the book has this
uppercase,
problem.
and the importance of words and
You
what
got
we
it.
invest in words. Okay, so thank you very much, and now we hear from Martha Prescott. Sorry, Martha. Sorry, Joan. Now we hear from Martha Prescott Norman Noonan.
Actually, just to follow up with Joan, one of the larger issues was capitalization of the civil rights movement. Because again, the Chicago Manual of Style speaks against it.
But they're Yankees.
But they're Yankees, right? I want to thank everybody for inviting us and putting together this program. And I just want to say a couple words about why I was so pleased to be involved in this project. I think it's very important that we tell our own story. And the remarks at the beginning made me think of one of the seminal moments for me as a history student, as an undergraduate, when I found out the Emancipation Proclamation didn't free anybody. This
is not breaking news.
This was eye-opening to me as someone who grew up in a culture that portrayed Lincoln as the emancipator, the great emancipator, and portrayed the slaves who actually set themselves free in the passive terms of freedmen. And so it brought home to me the message that if you want your history to last, you have to write it yourself. Quite a few women writing in the Hands on the Freedom Plow describe themselves as members of the Emmett Till generation. However, my parents kept this news of his lynching and burial away from me, perhaps because I was only 10 years old at the time. Also because of my age, I was not aware of the Montgomery bus boycott. My consciousness of the then contemporary Black Southern freedom movement began when I was in high school and was at first based around young people's efforts to desegregate public schools and universities. Their efforts resonated with me since during most of the time I was in elementary and high school, I was either just one or one of two black students in otherwise all-white schools. So I followed Daisy Bates and Little Rock 9 desegregating Central High School in Little Rock, and saw little kindergartners and first graders, as well as college students walking through vicious mobs to go to school. Watching the brave actions of Southern students made me feel I could handle the petty discriminations I encountered going to these schools and living in an all-white neighborhood. In Providence, Rhode Island, which is where I grew up. Next, I learned about Rosa Parks and the Nashville student movement, and so I came to think of myself as growing up in the Rosa Parks generation, a generation marked by the intense and courageous actions against racism. By the time I was in junior high school, I had experienced enough discrimination myself to want to be part of this movement. When I was 6 or so, my parents moved from one white neighborhood to another because my father, an optometrist, was losing his sight. My parents decided to close his office and buy a home that could accommodate a workspace for him as long as he was able to practice, a living space for the family, and rental space to partially make up for his lost income. They found an old funeral parlor close to a major intersection, and as it turned out, an area where black families were not welcomed. Our neighbors threw stones through our windows, tried to set the house on fire, and one even threatened us at gunpoint. Some of my teachers were also quite discouraging and placed limits on what I was able to do. Still, in those days, I was supposed to remain even-tempered and polite, since I was representing the race, as we called it then. It was being instructed in this role by my mother that I first heard the expression black and proud. When other people call you names, she said, and there's sure to be the dirty black N-word in there somewhere. She didn't say N-word. Don't respond by calling them names. Just say, yes, I'm black, and I'm proud of it. In addition to my own experience with discrimination, I grew up hearing older black people talk about their lives. One common thread was receiving educations that did not lead to commensurate employment, pharmacists and educators struggling to have jobs at the post office, like my own mother never having a job equal to their training and abilities. So there was always a level of bitterness and sadness in the background of these conversations. Anyway, I decided that I would go to Fisk University in Nashville to be close to the movement. But my parents also had made other plans. After making great sacrifices to supplement my scholarship to a Quaker prep school, they decided I was to attend the University of Michigan, from which my mother had graduated at 17 while working to support her family. So at the beginning of my junior year in high school, she found a job in Detroit, Michigan, and moved there so I could be an in-state student, the only way she felt she would be able to pay my tuition. Most of the time in those days, there was no needs-based financial aid, especially for black students, and I think it was the way that black students were actually kept out. Only a few were accepted to these major white institutions, but usually there was no accompanying support. My father and she lived apart for 2 years to fulfill their plans for my education. Reluctantly, I went to the University of Michigan, certain that I would be light years away from the Southern movement. I joined a Methodist student club to assure my parents that I was keeping the faith. But soon I veered off the acceptable path after accidentally hearing a speaker from the school's Voice chapter, which was associated with SDS, Students for Democratic Society. He was talking about campus racial struggles, peace, and other issues for student activism. It seemed right down my alley, and I joined what was basically an all-white group. But I will stress it was the only group on campus talking about racial issues there and in the nation. Of course, at that time, those of us who were representing the race weren't supposed to bring up divisive racial topics. We were to be a kind of goodwill ambassadors in our relationship with white students and keep our noses to the grindstone, appreciating the rare educational opportunity we had, and plan on attending graduate school to enter the professional classes. These were our marching orders as I understood. Shortly afterwards, I stepped off the path completely. And you told me fine. I have to shorten, though I timed it. A SNCC field secretary, Curtis Hayes, who was then, this is my first semester, appeared at one of the Methodist brown bag lunches. The second semester, Tom Hayden came back from jail in Albany, Georgia, and provided a direct contact to the Southern movement. He saw me working on peace issues in the SDS office and asked me what was I doing when my people were in motion all across the South. He then invited us to a SNCC SDS conference, April of 1962. When I went there were less than 75 people in the room. But it seemed that everyone in the room shared a political vision that included opposition to the war in Vietnam, opposition to racial and economic injustices, a general desire to liberalize, even radicalize the country, and end oppressive U.S. Diplomacy. And so the discussions at that meeting were wide-ranging. I'll go into some of those details if it comes up in the questions. But what was exciting to me was to meet both the student Southern activists that I admired from afar and find that they were highly politicized, radical students, that they were almost all black, and I felt I found a home, a place where I belonged. And I saw my life trajectory as becoming, quote, an agent of social change. This wasn't a profession on my parents' checklist. It was something we were creating out of our own, and Ms. Baker's vision of how community organizing should be done. It's something that stands in sharp contrast to previous notions of a talented tenth, or lifting as we climb, or today's notions of giving back. It was a joining with our communities, embedding ourselves, so to speak, in Southern Black communities, recognizing the political wisdom and knowledge already existing there, and expecting that people in these communities would determine the issues to be addressed. And so when I was working in the South, for instance, in Selma, we did a lot of things like try to get streetlights, take women who wanted to work at Dan River Mills. We tried to help Black men working for Pepsi Cola who wanted to unionize. Working in the South, I gained a deeper understanding of how just oppressive segregation was. It was a system that set wages for Black men and Black women at $12 a week for 6 days of 12-hour work. It was a system that enforced constant degradation of Black men and Black women, refusing to call them by anything but their first names and requiring that they address all white people, even young children, by a title. For me, this was all encapsulated when I went, and I did this only once, to canvass on a plantation, and there was a young woman there who was 18 years old, and she was tending a fretful baby. And I asked her, you know, was the baby sick? And she said, yes, I think the baby has pneumonia, but it's the 4th time this year, and my boss man won't allow me to take him to the doctor. Also working in South, I saw firsthand an unbelievable level of courage and determination on the part of Black Southerners who decided to fight for justice. When we were canvassing in Black communities in the South, when I was asking questions like, would you like to come to such and such a meeting or try to register to vote, the unspoken questions were, are you ready to lose your job? Go to jail or get beaten up? Oh, do you know that your house might be bombed? And ultimately, you might lose your life. There were people, thousands of them, who actually answered yes to these terms. Some of them earning, as I said, $12 a week or less, living in homes with walls covered by newspaper to keep out the cold. I don't know where they found that kind of courage. Maybe they were a little bit like me, used to living with fear and aware that being Black in America can be so dangerous anyway, that it makes sense to risk everything and enter an even more fearful situation whenever there's some small chance that freedom might be won.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. And our final speaker is again Betty Garman Robinson, who will talk to us about her experiences.
Thanks, Robin. So you might be skeptical of this statement, but I'm going to use it to reflect a little bit on my experience of being involved in the civil rights movement. Everything I needed to know about democracy, I learned in SNCC. Now, 50 years later, I find it ever more urgent that we collectively apply what we learned back then to be sure our country continues forward on the path of justice. So another theme for today, I like these themes, another theme for today is what kind of a country do we want? And for all of us, the question is, and for me it's a burning question, what kind of a country are we willing and prepared to work for? In my union work, for example, just to throw this in, we talk about if you're not for the union, then the boss is speaking for you, which I could give you lots of details about why that's true. But so you really do have to take a stand, and I'm encouraging all of you to take a stand on the side of justice. So I was born in New York City. I grew up in its suburbs. My parents were working class, but they were the first ones in their families to go to college. Among my very first memories are the time when we hung blankets in our windows to block out the light in the event there would be a German air raid, a German actually air attack. And I was also constantly exposed to racial prejudice and anti-communism in my home, something which for a young person I didn't quite understand, and it was pretty confusing. So I had a Mexican godmother who my mother called a dirty wetback. That was pretty confusing. I loved my Mexican godmother, and I didn't understand what that pejorative term was all about. One of my first boyfriends had a truck driver father, and my parents said he wasn't good enough for me, and that was another, like, what is that about? So I'm an average, pretty good student. I'm quite ordinary, however. I go off to Skidmore College, which was an all-women's college at the time, and it's in upstate New York. So I got involved in student activities through a network of college students. That was a time, the late 50s, early 60s. There were lots of student organizations on campus. We actively discussed political issues. We read about liberation movements in Africa especially. We did some organizing of students, mostly on academic freedom issues, the right to evaluate professors, which some of you now take for granted. We didn't have that. Maybe you don't take it for granted, I don't know. But there is that, whatever that website is, where you can go and rank your professors. You might rate my professor, right? All right. Which some young people turned me on to when I was taking a course at UMBC. We also organized students against the loyalty oath for college loans. You used to swear that you were not a communist, you never had been, you never would be a communist in order to get a federal college loan. And then we held forums on apartheid in South Africa and segregation in the US South. And it's my contention that if it wasn't for these organizational connections, those of us in the North, especially those of us who were white, well, definitely those of us who were white in the North, would really not have learned about conditions in the South, and we wouldn't have understood the bigger picture of institutional racism also happening in the North. So what did I do? In February of 1960, I was shocked to see college students in Greensboro arrested for sitting at a lunch counter. Arrested, beaten, coffee thrown on them, you name it. And students across the country began to demonstrate in support. So with leaflets titled "The Right to Eat" and "Let Your Voice Be Heard," we invited all Skidmore students to come to the student union, and we debated for about 3 or 4 days, what are we going to do? And it was very heated and there were lots and lots of critiques and heated discussions, and we finally decided that we were going to do a march to the Woolworths, the local Woolworths, which that was a target in the South. And 200 of the 1,200 students actually participated in the picket and marched downtown to the shopping center. After the march, there were heated street corner discussions of how to continue, and we decided to send 4 students every hour to continue this informational picket at Woolworths. But the first students were unofficially arrested. And so the fight became one of defending our own First Amendment freedoms. Now, parenthetically, there was a thing called in loco parentis at the time, which the college stood in the place of your parents. So the police took the 4 students and brought them to the college president's office, and then called us, who were the organizers of the march, to tell us that this was not acceptable behavior, that we shouldn't be doing this. The blowback, so that was part of the blowback from our action. Then we were told we were unladylike. It's 1960. And the newspaper said, the Saratoga newspaper said, those skiddies, they got more than they bargained for. But for us, it was a profound lesson in this with liberty and justice for all that we had learned, and what the real content of that was. So these were pretty powerful lessons about citizenship and democracy, and that's part of the reference back to I learned everything I needed to know about democracy in SNCC. So as college students today, would you be shocked to hear, as I was when I learned, as college students today, what would you be shocked to hear as I was when I learned that students could not sit at a lunch counter? Would you be shocked to hear that 25% of Black Americans were living in poverty as of 2011? Would you be shocked to hear that wait a minute. Would you think twice when you heard that the wealth gap between white and African American families nearly tripled in the 25 years between 1984 and 2009? 50 years after Brown v. Board of Education, schools are being questioned about their inability. Oh, she's giving me a 5-minute sign. Oh, gosh, okay.
That means you have 5 minutes.
I know.
You still have time.
Quite a bit of time.
I know. Okay. Anyway, 50 years after Brown v. Board of Education, schools are being questioned about their inability to deliver on the promise of equal education to children of color. I hope that you're aware of these things and that you are thinking that you can do something to make a change. So let's go forward to 1963 from 1960. I'm in graduate school in California, and Jim Foreman, who was the executive secretary of SNCC, calls me up and he says, why don't you come to the Howard, I'm saying this for Robin, not really, why don't you come to the Howard meeting over Thanksgiving of the SNCC staff? And so I go to Howard, and
What year is that?
it's 63, November 63, during Thanksgiving. It's I guess it's right after Kennedy has been assassinated. It's clearly after the March on Washington. It's after the church bombing in Birmingham. The tension is mounting in the country, and the need for people to step way out there and take risks is escalating. So Jim and others say to me, we need you to come south. And thinking back to me as an ordinary person, I was in the right place at the right time. And as Dr. King said in 1967, when he took a stand against the war in Vietnam, it was about taking risks. I mean, that's in retrospect, right? So I was really called by other young people to go south. And it was something you knew you had to do, even though you didn't really understand what the implications would be for your life. So in a movement, you need people for all roles. The main role I played was a support role. I worked to build the Friends of SNCC groups around the country that we did fundraising for the work in the South. We also did political support work in the North. I'm paraphrasing, this stuff is in my story in the book, but so there were, in the spring of 1964, there were a few dozen well-organized Friends of SNCC groups, and by 1964, late 64 and 65, there were over 60. So we had a national movement, and we had people involved who saw that dealing with the injustice of the South were also connected to the need for the country to be a place where that idea of equal justice could be present in all parts of the country. Because we also had local Friends of SNCC groups that started doing things in their northern cities and making the connections between what had been happening in the South and what was happening in the North. So one of the things we did that I think was pretty significant, because when I think about the mailings I get today from poverty organizations or criminal justice organizations, okay, I have 2 minutes. The mailing will say, it will really tell a sob story. And I'm not belittling the people whose stories are told in those mailings, but it doesn't, those fundraising appeals don't really make the political connection to what it means to use your money in a political way and to donate. So we saw fundraising as organizing. So it was organizing people to understand the implications of, as we were trying to do through the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which we haven't talked about at all, realign the Democratic Party so that the racist senators were no longer a part of that party, imagining that we could really change the country if we did that, and that's a whole other story. We can go into that. So what does it take? So how do we make a movement? And this is the introduction of the book talks about making a movement, and I think today on many people's minds is this question of how do we make a movement? What does the movement look like for today? What are the critical issues? How do we build leadership among the people most impacted? And there's lots and lots of organizing going on under the radar across the country. So I keep thinking, well, we're going to have a movement. It's going to be much more visible. And of course, there have been some signs of that, and I won't go into that. But Okay, so I just want to bookmark another thing that I learned about democracy was from Miss Baker, who again I encourage, as Judy did, encourage you to learn about Miss Baker. She had a particular philosophy of organizing which had to do with building a movement at the grassroots. And she also was very influential in in helping SNCC create one of the hallmarks of its internal culture, which was a non-hierarchical, group-centered kind of leadership where there was space for many voices and much debate. And Joan referred, of course, to the staff meetings that lasted into the middle of the night. So, okay, how am I gonna end this thing? So what I know about organizing today was kindled back in those days. And both through the book and reconnecting with SNCC friends and meeting other organizers across the country, I gave up a job at Johns Hopkins School of Public Health and went back to organizing. And I've been doing that now for 15 years, telling my family and friends that a new movement was coming. Movements, however, need thousands, hundreds of thousands of participants, especially they need conscious organizers to develop the strategy for action, do the research, develop the leaders, figure out the messaging and communication, and organize constituency. Movements are most powerfully led by the people impacted who can speak their truth to power, and movements need resources and support networks. And by the people most impacted, if you were to revisit the 1960s and to hear the statements, the speeches, hear about the people who made the powerful SNCC movement, you would see what I mean by the movements are most powerfully led by the people most impacted. So today, history is dealing us some unexpected hands in that racial, religious, gender, and class oppression has intensified. And especially since the election of an African-American president, we are seeing the overt racism, similar, I think, to what the Southern segregationists represented in the form of the Tea Party. The anti-union policies of the right have surfaced, both in Wisconsin and Michigan, and we also have this dangerous and outrageous wealth divide. So the world is a smaller place, and the oppressive structures in place globally, which reinforce war, greed, and anti-human rights values, are more powerful. And of course, our families are worrying about the lack and loss of jobs, housing foreclosures, increased college debt. People of color are caught in the dragnet of the new Jim Crow. So my sense is only a powerful national movement is going to be sufficiently transformative to bring about the scope of change that we need for today. And what we did then only stands in comparison to what was left undone and what needs to be done now. So I encourage each one of you to step out of your comfort zones, find your voice and your place in these times to build this new movement for human rights and justice.
All right. So Judy, Joan, Martha, and Betty are here to answer questions now and to engage in a kind of dialogue with you. I want to thank you all for your work, for the risks that you took, for the work that you have devoted your lives to doing and what you represent as women, as Americans. And I'm just, so honored again to be a part of this with you. Have my own stories to tell.
For sure you do.
And
We'd like you to
as
tell
we all might from a certain era in this country, or whose parents were Southerners, and many of our parents or
With a
grandparents
capital
were.
S.
Sorry?
With a capital S.
Capital S. Yeah, that just really did sound like an English department kind of, or a writing program kind of discussion for 20 years. So if you have questions, please feel free to take the mic. I think there was going to be somebody wandering with a mic, but you can start here. And of course, it's going to be Brother Tapscott. And if I may, Mr. Tapscott and I grew up in the same neighborhood here in Washington, D.C. And we tell everybody this, so if you're sick of hearing this story, I'm sorry. And our neighborhood was a white and black neighborhood until the middle of first grade. All the white people were gone by the end of first grade. And our community was, the city was, very, very different city.
What neighborhood was it?
That was Northeast. We called it North Michigan Park, but that's the name we made up. You're in Lamont Riggs. You're on the other side of South Dakota Avenue. For those of you, I'm sorry for those of you who are not from here, but yeah. So you may remember. So your question, sir. Yeah, you,
Well,
sir.
I did have a question, actually. I was going to do this to take around. So whoever's ready, raise a hand because I'll come to you. But I wanted to ask, what do you think is the biggest challenge for young people in terms of turning from a college student to a college student activist?
Student loans.
I was thinking like Facebook or something like that.
Yeah.
What do you think is going on?
I'll tell
with
you,
this?
let me just say, what we realized is that we really could change stuff. We knew this. You know, I might not have known it when I came into SNCC, but the whole environment of SNCC is we're going to do stuff. You know, it's going to change stuff. And it started really, I think, with Reagan. You know, I mean, it's not just the young people don't think they can do diddly. Adults don't think they can do diddly. You know, and so there's a sense that it doesn't matter whether you vote. You know, so when you say to young people, you got to vote. Well, what difference does it make? Why would they do all this stuff to stop you from voting? You know, changing the polling booths, making sure that in Texas you can use as a voter ID a gun license, but not a student ID, right? Why would the League of Women Voters say we can't even deal with Florida anymore, you know, registering voters, and they're nonpartisan, right? Why would they do all this stuff to stop you from voting if it didn't mean anything, right? But there is a sense that young people just feel that there's nothing they can do to change things. And one of the things that was the most valuable stuff that we knew is that you really could do stuff.
I was only half joking about student loans.
I think that is a...
I think that.
Because I think that the ability, we stopped whatever we were doing. In my case, my parents disowned me when I went south, but it cost me $600 a semester to go to school. You know, you can cobble
Let that
that
sink
together.
That last 13 seconds here, Gina.
And so we had a freedom that I don't feel that today's college students have available to them as they pile up these loans. I love Susie Orman, you know, who just says, you know, you shouldn't borrow more than what you're going to earn the first year out. So I really think that's there. I think it's purposeful. And it is restrictive. I think it's highly restrictive. The other thing that I think that we had, and I think sort of unlike Judy and Betty, I feel like I just came to the movement. I was the same person coming in, coming out. It was a home for me. I think having time and courses where you can actually think through what kind of society you'd like to see, how you're going to get there, what kinds of things have been done in the past. And again, I think we were fortunate in that we had elders before us, like Miss Baker. Mrs. Parks was in Detroit when I was there as a fundraiser, and she kind of came to everything. We had people like Jim Lawson who had done this, and we had opportunities. I think everybody sort of indirectly has referred to it, but when I was at Michigan, we had, and this wasn't exactly what I envisioned college life to be like, on a Friday night, we had studies on the left. And we got together and we read and we talked about what kind of society we'd like to see and what mechanisms were there to arrive. And the last thing I would say is that I also think we had a tremendous historical opportunity. You know, sort of, you know, the moon was in the 7th house and Jupiter was aligned with Mars. And there was a small opportunity to push for change, and we were able to take that and push it wide open. And so I think part of thinking about change and thinking about the society that you want is also being able to recognize when the opportunity, when the historical opportunity is there to make change. And it's not there every day.
There's a question in here.
My grandmother, who died maybe not quite 2 years ago, when President Obama was elected, as you can imagine, just cried and said she never thought she'd see it. And I wonder, one, did you expect to see an African-American president in your lifetime? And two, did you have expectations for change? And are you pleased or displeased with what you've seen happen in the last 5 years?
I can start. You know, when Clinton was elected in 1992, one of the things that we talked about was how, because that was a breath of fresh air, and it was, you know, he brought a new energy. He certainly had an engaging personality, and he made a lot of promises during his campaign. But one of the things we talked about is that you can never count on one person, one individual in one office to really make the change. And maybe we said that, we as just my group of friends who talk about this stuff all the time, maybe we said that because we had been involved in the social movement, and so we knew what transformative change was about. So I did work for Obama's election. The first time I worked really hard. I went to Pennsylvania for 5 days. I canvassed every other weekend. And I don't think that until he came on the stage, the national stage, I don't think I imagined that we would have an African-American president. But by the same token, I think, and yes, he did raise expectations because he had a way of speaking to us that made us think that there would be change, but to have believed that one man could do it was not where I was at. So, you know, of course, he hasn't lived up. He hasn't lived up to expectations. But again, we have a whole structural system that needs to be tackled. So that's kind of where I sit.
I like. First of all, I cried. I mean, I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and when I went to vote for him the first time, it came unexpectedly. I mean, I picked up my registration form and I started, sobbing. And then I got into the booth and I'm splattering the ballot, you know, with tears. And I come out and I see somebody, I was like, could you believe this? I really was. I was absolutely caught up in it. But, you know, one of the things that I am reminded of is something that Howard Zinn said, who was just wonderful, right? And he had this piece called Changing Obama's Mindset. And he said, we are citizens and Obama is a politician. You might not like that word, but the fact is, he's a politician. He's other things too. He's very sensitive and intelligent and thoughtful and promising, but he's a politician. So if you're a citizen, you have to know the difference between them and you. The difference between what they have to do and what you have to do. And there are things they don't have to do. If you make it clear to them, they don't have to do it. Now, I thought of that because one of the things that I usually talk about is also the Dream Act kids, because I'm just amazed at how they have organized, and they are so interesting in terms of using not just the social networks. So I clip all this stuff out, and you know, there's this one young woman who was in the Times January 11th, right? And it talks about how she is Erica Andiola, and she is 25 years old and co-founder of the Arizona Dream Act Coalition, right? And so suddenly, in the middle of the night, ICE, immigration authorities come in and they pull out her brother and her mother in the middle of the night to deport them. Now, she had gotten a work permit under a program begun by the Obama administration, and she had therefore graduated from Arizona State University in 2009. But when her folks get swept up, she immediately goes on to Twitter, and she does a tearful video on YouTube, And she says, quote, "I need everybody to stop pretending that nothing is wrong. Stop pretending that we're all just living normal lives, because we're not. This could happen to any of us anytime." And they mention in this, they say, both of them come back into the home within 24 hours. And the Times piece says, their swift releases underline the power of the youth immigrant movement and their social media activism, which was critical in spreading Miss Andiola's story. One of the things she has combined with that is the Latino vote in the last election. So it's all of that stuff. They're organizing. They, as a matter of fact, talk about the civil rights movement and how they're taking some of their cues from the movement back then of young people. And so, but one of the reasons I mention this is because it mentions in this article that the Obama administration has deported, since he took office, roughly 400,000 people each year, a record unmatched since the 1950s. So the question is how you then, it's a balance act. Yeah.
I have to agree with Obama is a politician. We shouldn't forget that. And there are certain traits inherent in politicians 99% of the time. But I had never imagined that I would live to see an African-American president. And my reaction was not the great joy that was there, but that I had to go to Medgar Evers' grave. My mind was just caught up.
Explain who he is.
Explain him. Medgar Evers was the NAACP leader in Mississippi who was assassinated in '63 at the height of the demonstrations there. And he and so many other people who died making it possible for Obama to be elected. That just played on me. I just had to go and leave my Obama pin at Medgar's grave. And then I could step out of the past and into the hope of the future. And I think this, we were talking about what issues and what young people today can get wrapped up in. I think the Latinos are showing us the way. It's not the college kids.
Well, some of them are, but yes.
Well, some, but it's
It's that
huge-
age group, yes.
It's that age group, and immigration, to me, is a major issue, whether you're from Kenya or from South America. I don't think anybody in this room's ancestors came here because conditions were really great back in the home country.
Except ours. Oh.
Yeah.
But you didn't come here because they were great.
Yeah, but
No,
I don't want
I got you.
But
You came in voluntarily.
There's always this sort of need to say, but there's an exception to
Yes,
that.
that's right.
There's
That's
always
right,
this
yeah.
exception.
And I think on this issue as African Americans, we always have to remember that we still rank lowest besides Native Americans on this poll. And then that we have to ask, what does immigration mean for us? And why is it so supported by corporations? I mean, it's a whole nother question of what that means in the long run. I was happy. I never expected that a black person would be elected president in my lifetime. I think the thing that struck me the most was that there were white South Carolinians voting for Obama. I wasn't disappointed. I thought he was very clear on who he was and what he was going to do. I mean, he didn't say, I'm against the war. He said, I'm going to leave Iraq and go into Afghanistan. He was very clear on who he was and, what kind of view he had. He said, my children don't need affirmative action. So I think he was clear in his campaign. I still think he's a wonderful role model for Black American children. I think it means a lot that he's there. It doesn't mean that there's less racism in the country or less racial oppression. It means we have a black president. And, I like it.
I see.
That's right.
I'll get there in a couple minutes. Young people, you have to pick.
First of all, I just want to say thank you. And it's so wonderful to hear you talk about Ella Baker. In a class that I had in the fall of 2011, we read Barbara Ransby's wonderful biography of Ella Baker.
It's great.
And I think the title is something like Ella Baker and the Black Freedom Struggle. So I also recommend the book as well. So I suppose I have a question that's in two parts. I'm from South Carolina, so I understand the idea of capitalizing the S in Southerner. But I'm struck by how 3 of the 4 of you are from the North, or the Northeast, I gather. So I wanted to know whether there were tensions between the Northern students and the Southern students, because Ms. Richardson, you began by saying that there were struggles and there were conflicts, but you all found a way to get beyond those. And I also wanted to know, what was it like to be one of the few black students on those mostly white Northern campuses? So I left South Carolina at 18 and went to college in Massachusetts.
Where?
Mount Holyoke and South Hadley. And I'm a proud Mount Holyoke woman, but I'm also aware that for a number of years, African Americans were simply allotted, I think, maybe 2 spots in each class at most, until I think about the mid-1960s. So there have been times when I have thought, what was it like to be here in what is still a very rural northern setting? What was it like to be here, and maybe to feel as if you weren't entirely alone, but you were very, very nearly alone. So again, thank you all so much.
So who wants to take the first one, north, south?
Yes, there was tension, but I think it was in most cases culturally driven, that the northern cultures and the assumptions and the southern ones, whether you're black or white, it was 2 distinct cultures. Those Yankees in jail, they didn't know what grits were. And I think that was behind a lot of the tension. Of course, you had some northern students that would come down, particularly the white ones, and try and tell the folks in the South how to do things, which without having a clue as to the local lay of the land.
We also, one of the things we also did as white Northern students was we brought all of our racial baggage. I mean, we all grow up in this country, and there's a lot of racism in the country, and there are assumptions that we don't challenge until they're stripped away through struggle or through experience. And so we brought a lot of that baggage south. And, but at the same time, within SNCC, there were tensions around race, class, northern, southern, better educated, less well educated, local people, and the college educated students. So there were a lot of tensions that had to be navigated with great sensitivity and with great care to have the organization be able to work in a unified way.
I think, I guess we all had different experiences. And I think I worked mostly on projects that were overwhelmingly black. And even when I was in Albany, the staff was mostly black, the students are black. And, you know, as a northern black person, at that time, particularly coming from Detroit, the culture was the same. It was a situation in which I felt comfortable, in which I didn't feel there was that much tension. You know, if I had to go to, you know, if we had to make announcements in church, well, they'd send me to an AME church, because I grew up in an AME church. So I would know that. Do I think that someone who was a Southerner, for instance, my first husband also worked for SNCC, and he was from Augusta, Georgia. Yeah, he was right there and much more comfortable in that situation. And I think it was easier for him to do things, but I never felt it to be a tense situation or uncomfortable. And I remain friends with almost all the people that I work with on those projects for the rest of my life. Yeah.
And you say Detroit, which marks where you're from, instead of Detroit. So even
Right.
the language is different. There were times since I could, understand Southern and New York both, that I would literally stand with a New York lawyer and a Southern black person on a court case. They'd be discussing it, and I would have to simply repeat what one of them had said, and they could both understand me, but they couldn't understand each other. So I wasn't really translating. I was simply repeating. There was that much difference. Occasionally I had to sort of rephrase something a little bit, but it got interesting.
The cultural difference that I felt, and I talk about it in the book, to me was more a movement culture, where people on these projects had been around each other for a while, and they would talk, they were very efficient with the use of words. And I said I felt as if I had entered a Clint Eastwood Western, really, it was that kind of a situation. And I'm pretty talkative. And that was my biggest problem, was keeping my mouth shut.
Can I also mention, I would agree with Betty that there, and Martha, I think there were all these tensions. When I look back on it, it's amazing that we were so successful, because all that stuff existed, But you also were embedded, as Martha said, in this local community, so you had them not only nurturing you, but also, one of the things Ms. Baker always talked about is, if you do this now in this community, what's going to happen 3 weeks from now? What's going to happen 7 months from now? And so that as 17, 18-year-olds, you're being asked to think beyond what you ever, you used to think about next week and the weekend, right? You're now being said, you have a responsibility here. And so there was some stuff that could have exploded, I think, that didn't. I would also say one other thing, which was, and then we should talk about being black on a white campus, but I did not have this, right? But a lot of the northern folks had southern roots. So Ruth Howard, she's back in North Carolina, because her folks are from Rocky Mount.
Yeah.
Charlie Cobb, when he goes to Greenville, his folks are from Greenville. Yeah. So it's like there were all these people who had these bases that that were there already. Yeah.
Or the black folks, but the white folks that were coming down south did not have southern roots.
Oh God, no.
Right.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, God
Thank you.
knows exactly.
No, that's right.
And we brought our
point. And they were-
brought our baggage.
Yes.
We
And they
definitely
were
did.
like foreigners. They were like, the folks who were southern roots or who were in the south, they were home. They understood this. The white northerners that came down were like going into a war zone in their minds, as often as not. And that's 2 different levels of comfort.
And because of some of the, I guess you could call them domestic terrorist acts, they actually were going into a war zone. You know, many of them were killed, right? I have a quick question.
They didn't answer
The
the second
black,
part.
being black on a predominantly. Let me just say, when I come into Swarthmore, as I said, we were the big class with the 8. Well, they made sure there were only, that of the 8, 4 were boys and 4 were girls, so that we wouldn't have to date outside a little group, They made sure that all of us were rooming with Quaker children, because it was assumed that we would be more acceptable. When the demonstrations start, and we are more in jail in Cambridge, Maryland than we are on campus, it really split the campus. And when we went to Swarthmore to talk about this, what was good about it is that, too much. One of the things about storytelling, and you find it with filmmaking, is, okay, where do you start and where do you stop the story? And then how much context do people need in order to understand what you're talking about? I tend to give too much context. So I'm going to stop saying what I was about to say, and I'll just say that when we started doing the demonstrations, the student newspaper had a lot about the fact that we were not doing right, because the main thing was to get our education. And I remember being seeing a white student, who had amazed me, because I had been in this Russian history class, and he knew how to say Yanin instead of Lenin, and that was shocking. He had been all over Europe. I had been to Buffalo, right? That was the only plane trip I'd ever been on. And so I really thought, oh my goodness, he's worldly and stuff. I remember overhearing him when we started doing these demonstrations, and I overhear him saying, the Negro students would be better off if they got their education and stopped doing all of this stuff, because they could better help their people. And I heard another white student say, you know, it is the perfect right of a business to exclude whomever it wants to exclude. And that was prevailing assumption, not just in the South, but in the North. Northerners assume that's their right. They're the proprietor. They own the store. They get to say who comes in and doesn't come in. So yeah, that was.
I think I escaped a lot of what it meant. You know, after growing up the way I did, I didn't want to be in an all-white situation. Even though I was in an all-white situation in SDS, it was very different, I think, because some of the SDSs, Casey was there. Southerners were Southerners, and others had a history of interracial relationships. So it was a very different group of people on the Michigan campus. Also, unlike what I had been, you know, when we were young, we were told in these situations, you're not supposed to clump.
Bunch.
But at Michigan, the black students clumped. So it was fine. So there were these two groups, so that my interaction with white students was pretty much only with progressive white students on the campus, and my interaction with black students were in these all black situations. There were about 300 black students at Michigan out of a population of 30,000. But it was enough, and also, which I think happened at some of the Eastern schools, the fraternities and the sororities interacted with the black students at other schools. They made this, I wasn't, you know, like deep into it because I started doing this other stuff, but I realized my freshman year that like there was a calendar. The fraternities and sororities got together from Michigan, Michigan State, and Eastern Michigan, and they made a calendar of social events. So there was something going on every weekend somewhere. And it was a kind of neat experience. And it was much better. I didn't feel isolated. That was not true. That socially, that was not true in the classroom. I remember being in a chemistry section where the instructor would never recognize my hand. We used to joke, you know, for grades, B is for black, C is for color. We didn't expect to be graded equally. It was just, we didn't expect it. It wasn't even like, oh, well. And I think the kind of normal interaction, for instance, I think I got the second highest grade on a chemistry exam in a class of 500. In any other situation, the professor would have come to me and said, are you interested in chemistry? You know, there would have been some overture. The only time I ever got an overture was when I was a graduate student at Wayne State. And the professor asked to speak to me after class and, you know, asked would I be interested in going into history. And I was like, why is he doing this? It just, you know, I didn't even know it was done until it was finally done to me. And so I think it was hard for students. But the ones that sort of did do what we were supposed to do and kept their nose to the grindstone and everything, they benefited in the end, I think, from the movement. Because by the time the movement made change, they were in a position for excellent jobs.
We have a few more minutes. Let's see.
One more question over here.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Cameron. I'm from Louisville, Kentucky, so a little sort of Southern, sort of Midwest. And I had a question about going back to the politics, activism side of it. My senator, one of my senators is Rand Paul.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
Aren't you lucky?
Yeah, lucky. And he has recently come out,
He did?
newly, you know, come out, not infuriated, come out in favor of some sort of immigration reform, right?
Right.
And so, and I find myself asking how I should feel about that, whether that's, you know, is that a victory, or is that because it's kind of understood that it's something that he has to do for the sake of the Republican Party, and, you know, it's not because he believes that it's right, but more so because they are losing the Latino vote, and so they want to, you know, try and get it back. I'm just wondering if you could speak to the idea of when you get a political victory, is there usually this idea that, like, yes, we've done something right, or is it hollowed out at all? Yeah.
You know, before you answer, he was speaking before a group, I can't remember the name of the group, but there was a group of Hispanic, the audience was Hispanic, and he made a comment of using words that had path to citizenship in the sentence, in the same sentence. But later that afternoon, he backpedaled in a beautiful way. It was fast from that statement, because he had, you know, I guess he had been called on the carpet about that. But that clearly people are trying to figure out how to, you know, seduce the voting, the dreamers somehow, because you're right, it's a powerful coalition. Or organization. I'm not sure if they've started doing that coalition building, which would make them a particularly powerful force. Yeah. So,
First of all, no, I don't believe him. Yeah.
case closed.
Well, I think one of the things that, if I go back 50 years and we were being on the front line of the struggle, you could not have told me that I would be fighting the same issues today as I was 50 years ago, and they're just in slightly different clothing. I think poverty and wealth gap is one of the big issues of today. So I think immigration reform, while it has to take place, and I'm passionately for it, and I will support the Dreamers and other organizations that are fighting for it, it could be just a surface victory. It might not go deeper as far as what the change I think the country has to have in terms of true justice for all communities. So that's maybe when Rand Paul says he's for immigration reform, he's saying it for the political expediency of it, but and maybe he will figure out with the other senators and congressmen some minimal way to make some changes, but that won't go deep enough, and I don't think that as much as what we did was super profound and important, I don't think we went deep enough in terms of transforming the way the country works.
Well, I think they're all fooling us. And because I think it's in the interest of corporations in this country to have a lot of workers running around.
That's true.
Low income, too.
And
Yes,
in fact,
race to the bottom.
right, and in fact,
Non-union.
the Bureau of Immigration was set up just for that purpose, to ensure that there would be more people looking for jobs. That, you know, it was a definite anti-union effort. And as I say, it's something that I feel very cautious about. Yeah, I think in the back of his mind, he's happy to bring in more people. It's not, I think there's, the issue that got me after the election is that the black vote won this election. It was the black vote in cities, in states that have large electoral votes that won this election. And no one is talking about what is do the black community politically after this all-out effort? I haven't heard a thing. Have you, I mean, did I miss it?
But don't you think that has also to do with the fact that we don't, I'm not seeing the kind of energy coming from the black community as a unified force. I'm not. As I'm seeing from these dreamers. And I'm not talking about the adults, because a lot of them can't come out and...
How many people came out to the polls?
No, I'm
That's
not.
a
I'm saying
unified force.
after that. I mean, one of the things that you see with these, with the dreamers is, as a matter of fact, one of them says, you know, if they don't start, if the Republican Party doesn't start getting right, they will never see the inside of the Oval Office again. You know, I guess I'm looking for the kind of energy that I see here, you know, that says, we're going to throw you all out.
It's a different situation. There's no real possibility of the black population voting Republican.
Right.
So that kind of
That's right.
that kind of discussion or organization isn't going to work. But, you know, certainly Al Sharpton, the head of the NAACP, all these people have Obama's ear.
Ben Jealous?
Ben Jealous. They have Obama's ear. They have a bully pulpit. And I have yet to hear anybody say, you know, we've got, and I think your statistics are nice, Betty. I think it's much greater.
Yeah, I think
I
so.
think half of the black population in this country is living in poverty and close to poverty. And 80% of black children are living in poverty. I didn't hear anybody say, you know, maybe we ought to do something about this. Maybe it shouldn't be that immigrant population after immigrant population comes to this country and does better economically than those of us who've been here for 400 years and helped build the country. I'm waiting.
Well, now, I see what could be going on is what used to go on in the South, where the politicians would pit the poor whites against the poor blacks. And I can see this becoming pitting the poor Hispanics against the black population. And I think this could be one of the things that's going on. I mean, particularly within the Republicans, you know. I'm not sure, and because one issue needs attention doesn't mean you ignore other issues. The poverty, the problems within the black community that are a result of policies need to be addressed. Definitely, they delivered the vote. But at the same, that doesn't exclude doing something on the immigration or the dreamers. And the school where I worked, we had a very large Ethiopian population of immigrants who trying to get their families together. I mean, it's impossible. It was impossible to get, you know, you got somebody in and to bring over somebody else. Or if you leave to go visit a sick elderly relative, you couldn't get back. Something is wrong with our policies across the board on people coming to this country.
We are very, I'm sorry, we're going to have to cut it off. Because we're actually doing very well. And, you know, as the saying goes, the struggle continues.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
This is a conversation that our country has been having for generations and generations, and it continues. And the challenge is for you, students particularly, to learn from, get the book. It is
Get the book.
Get the book.
Get the book.
See, I'm pimping your book.
Are we signing afterwards?
You were going to, yes, you're going to be going to a table in the lobby, and books will be available for signing. Read the book, study the book. It's an opportunity to learn from the folks who shaped history. I mean, they're just regular folks maybe, but they're really not, who helped to create the country that you live in today. And we can, and it holds up a mirror actually reflecting what needs to be done still. So I want to thank you, Judy Richardson, Joan Mulholland, Martha Noonan, and Betty Robinson for your work and for your wonderful presentations today.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.